couple had two little boys, 8 and 10. And they were, well, let's just say they were boys in every sense of the word. It seemed like they were in trouble all the time, in the middle of any mischief that went on in their town. And their parents had reached the point where they'd had enough. Something had to be done, so the mother decided to contact their pastor and see if he could be of some help. The pastor, a big man with a booming voice, agreed to talk to the boys, but asked to meet with them separately. So the mother brought the 8-year-old in first the next morning, planning to bring the 10-year-old that afternoon. When the little guy arrived, the pastor sat behind his big, intimidating desk, leaning back in his big black leather chair, and asked the boy, "Have you seen God?" The boy's mouth dropped open, but he gave no response. He just sat there, wide-eyed, with his mouth hanging open. The pastor leaned forward with his elbows on the desk and repeated the question in a slightly sterner tone. "Have you seen God?" Still the boy just sat there. Finally, the pastor stood up, walked around the desk, towering over the little boy, and asked again, "Have you seen God?" At this point, the boy bolted from the chair, out the door, past his mother, and ran out of the church building. He didn't stop running until he got home, 3.5 blocks from the church. He blew through the front door of the house, up the stairs, and straight into the closet of the bedroom he shared with his brother, who was lying there on his bed. After a minute or two, the older boy opened the closet door very slowly and asked, "Are you okay? What happened?" The younger boy, still gasping for breath and shaking a little, said, "We're in big trouble this time. God is missing, and they think we took him." Certainly not a new joke. You've probably heard it before, but none of us has, in fact, ever seen God. But he is definitely not missing. In fact, God told David, "Seek my face." And he told Jeremiah, "I will be found by you." To seek God's face is to be purposefully aware of his presence. Of course, God is omnipresent. He is everywhere, completely transcendent of time and space. And so his presence is a given. However, our awareness of his presence is another matter. To be purposefully aware of God's presence in our day-to-day lives is the concept of Coram Deo. Fancy Latin phrase, if you're a Latin scholar. It became a rallying cry during the Reformation, in the days of Martin Luther. It is a mindset that is formed by being conscious of God's presence, by disciplining ourselves to look for evidence of him, to be constantly aware that he is in fact with us. It is a passion for seeking God's presence every day. I believe we were made for this. And so we begin a new series of messages this morning on the subject of Coram Deo. And as I said, believe you and I were created. We were made for this type of living. And if you haven't already turned there, I invite you to turn to Psalm 139, which Jim has already read for us. But open it up and take a look at it. And I draw your attention to verses 13 through 18. We'll cover 13 through 18 this Sunday. And next week we're going to back up and do the verses before that. And so we see in these verses from Psalm 139 3 or 4 C's. I'm not sure how far we're going to go with all of these this morning. First of all, you are created in God's image. Created being the first of the C's. David says in verse 13, "You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." And the fact and our awareness that we are created in God's image changes everything. Now, don't misunderstand. God does not look like any of us. That's not what it means. Which of us would he look like, do you suppose? And aren't you glad he doesn't look like us? God is spirit, Jesus said in John 4. And so he does not have a literal face or hands, and he's not contained in any sort of body. And in fact, he prohibited us from trying to figure out what he looks like and fashioning any kind of image. That's what the second commandment means when it says, thou shalt not make any graven images. Even in the case of Jesus, who is in fact God incarnate and has always existed as part of our Trinitarian God, even in his case, in John 1 we read, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Therefore, Jesus existed before becoming flesh, before entering our lives as that baby in Bethlehem. The image of God is not a physical thing so much as it is something within each of us, you individually, me individually, that looks just like God. Call it a family resemblance, if you will. And you are created in God's image. Now, based on that, Coram Deo begins with what I like to call God esteem. Now, you've probably heard of self-esteem. I think, in fact, we've become way too focused on self-esteem, as if my perception of myself is somehow best, and if I feel good about myself, I will succeed in life. From Scripture we learn, myself, what Paul called my flesh, is dead. Myself will always let me down. In fact, Paul wrote in Romans 7, I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. And what I hate, I do. Can you relate? I admit it. I can. How many things do we want to do and we simply don't? And how many things do we know we shouldn't do and we go right on and do them anyway? Paul shared our dilemma. That's why self-esteem doesn't work. But God-esteem, his idea of me, his idea of you, is infinitely better than self-esteem. In fact, it is the perfect me, not just your best self. I've grown to resent that phrase, my best self, because it does not line up with God's esteem. I want my perfect self. I want myself as God made me. And so do you. It is grounded in his creative work and his love for us. And so in Coram Deo, I choose to remain aware of the fact constantly that I am created in the image of God. And his idea of me is perfect. And that's what we strive for. Secondly, in verses 14 through 16, you were created in God's image carefully and extravagantly. Notice what David says in those verses. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. And so not only did God create you in his image, he created you fearfully and wonderfully, as David puts it. The word fearfully comes from the Hebrew word Yahweh, which means fearfully in the sense of reverence, or being extremely careful. And so we are carefully made. And when God created you, he was careful with you. He had a plan in creating you, and He executed His plan to perfection. Not only are you fearfully made, you are wonderfully made, which is distinct and unique, marvelous, one of a kind. I don't know if they do this kind of thing now. I'm way too old to know what younger people do, but when I was young, designer originals were really kind of the thing, and designer jeans became a big deal, and everybody had their jeans with a certain stitching on the pocket, and all of that thing came and went, and I never had designer jeans because in those days my mother made all of my clothes, and so when I was in college, she made me 3 sets of jeans. Now, I look back now and think, I wore custom-made clothes all the way up until I moved out on my own. Didn't appreciate it so much then because Mom made these jeans and she even stitched the logo of the college that I was attending on the pockets so that there was a designer mark on there. But then she put this tag. You know where the tag goes on that back right pocket of your jeans? It said, "Made with love by Mommy." Now, what do you think my college buddies did with that? You see, when God made you, He went overboard. He was extravagant. Think of it. He gave you eyes to see, not just 1, 2. He gave you ears to hear and a mouth to speak. He gave you hands with opposable thumbs, which most of the animal kingdom is jealous of. He went overboard. He gave you a brain that is more advanced than any computer, and right now is doing things that you don't control, and maintaining things, and taking care of stuff you've never even thought of taking care of. But if it didn't do it, you wouldn't be here with us this morning. And in all of that, He gave you a uniqueness that carries with it intrinsic value because of His image. But not just His image. The fact that He created you with a plan, and the fact that while He was creating you, He went way overboard and was extravagant. Consider for a moment the far-reaching ramifications of seeing yourself as intrinsically valuable because of God's creative perfection and love, while also seeing everyone else that way. Through the lens of God's image and love, I no longer have to worry so much about how people evaluate me. Now, we want people to like us. I know. The person that says, "I don't care what anybody thinks," no, don't do that. Not only is it really not true, but it's no way to live. We do care what other people think, but we don't have to let them grade us. We don't have to let our sense of who we are come from them, because we're created in God's image. And He created us with a plan, and He created us extravagantly. So I no longer have to worry about people who are critical and overly so. If I see others through the lens of God's image and love, respect and compassion are a given, aren't they? Even if I can't stand that other person. Even if they have caused me terrible grief and made my life difficult. Even given all of that, they are created in God's image. Let that roll around in your noggin. And while you're doing it, we studied this on Wednesday night, get in your mind a picture of Jesus washing the feet of His disciples, including Judas, moments before Judas left the room and set about his plan to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew it. And still He served Judas. That's our example, friends. That's how we see others. If I see others through the lens of God's image and love, racism becomes absolutely intolerable. It cannot exist in the body of Christ. It must not. Justice becomes a requirement, and I would be motivated to see that everyone has it, because all are created in God's image. Equality becomes a benchmark, and I must exercise whatever privilege I have to ensure no one is marginalized or abused or ridiculed or hated, and everyone has a chance to live as a valuable child of God. I didn't say this was going to be easy. And it is a challenge to us, isn't it? We all have our prejudices. We all have our biases. I've learned that through this doctoral adventure I've been on that is now stretching, it seems, into infinity. And doing the research, my advisor is constantly reminding me everyone has bias. And the only way to overcome the bias is to admit it and deal with it as it relates to your data. Everyone has issues with someone. And the only way to overcome it is to admit it and deal with it in light of Coram Deo, seeking the face of God. You see, if I see the world and my culture through the lens of God's perfect creative work and love, I will see all people through His eyes. People on whom He places great value. And the church must rise to the top. Move to the front of the class in communicating this. In Coram Deo, we choose to see ourselves and everyone else as carefully and extravagantly created, endowed with an intrinsic worth that must be respected, regardless of any other factors. And then third, you are created in God's image carefully and extravagantly for Coram Deo. David said it in verses 17 and 18. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. And when I awake, I am still with you. You ever wonder what God's thinking? Don't go too deep with that one. You're not built for that. David called God's thoughts precious to me. And I went back and checked, and this is the Hebrew phrase, yukareia. And it literally means how precious, valuable, and amazing are your thoughts, purposes, and goals. And David declared how vast is the sum of them. They are of great worth. They're valuable. And it reminds me, I love that scene in The Shack, if you've seen that movie, where Papa, the character that represents God, tells Mac, honey, you have no idea how much I'm doing right now. Think about all the things that God is doing just for you. Just for me. Check your pulse. He's still there. Got air to breathe? Yeah. You hear all that's going on outside. The birds are going about their business, and our friends and neighbors are moving about town, and things are going on. And all the while inside of you, as I said earlier, there are functions and systems working and all kinds of things going on within you that you, at least I don't understand all of them. Do you? What exactly makes my heart pump? I'm told it's like an electrical charge. I've got electricity in me. But I don't understand all of that. I know that if it stops, I've got a problem. And that's about all I know. I think of my body sometimes as, I really would think I should have a check engine light, but at this point it would always be on. And yet God is working, moving, doing things. And that's just in me. Now add up all the billions of other people. And He's working in them too. And while you're at it, throw in the cosmos, just for good measure. and all the stuff that's going on, and all the planets and stars and everything that's moving around, and everything that's happening. And no wonder David said, how vast is the sum of them. Coram Deo is not an effort to define God or to figure out everything he is thinking or doing. That'd be ridiculous. It is about being aware of his presence in our daily lives. It is about practicing his presence in a way that impacts our thoughts and our words and our actions. It is about enjoying his presence, letting him encourage us and lead us and use us every day. And so I'd like for us, when it comes time to reflect, to let that seed plant in our minds. Coram Deo. Today, and tomorrow, and every day after. In Coram Deo, we choose to see God at work all around us and glory in his presence in every aspect of our lives. You are created in God's image, carefully and extravagantly, for Coram Deo. And so walk in peace and joy and love and hope. And show compassion and respect. Practice the presence of God. The presence is already there. Just be aware of it. And glory in it. And here's a practical place to start. I saw this on somebody's Facebook page, of all places, this week. And it's a quote written originally by Andy Stanley. Sometimes I just want it all to stop. Talk of COVID, looting, brutality, racism, division. I lose my way in all of it, and I become convinced that this new normal is real life. Then I meet an 87-year-old who talks of living through polio, diphtheria, World War II, Vietnam protests, and yet is still enchanted with life. He seemed surprised when I said 2020 must have been especially challenging for you. No, he said slowly, looking me straight in the eyes. I learned a long time ago not to see the world through the headlines. I see the world through the people around me. I see the world with the realization that we love big. Therefore, I choose to write my own headlines. Husband loves a wife today. Family drops everything to come to Grandma's bedside. He patted my hand and smiled. Old man makes a new friend. His words collide with my worries, freeing them from the tether I had been holding so tight. And they float away. I am left with a renewed spirit and a new way to write my own headlines. So write this headline. Child of God sees his face.